There are moments in life that no amount of preparation can soften. Moments that land like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything you thought was stable. For Prince William, the heir to the British throne, one of those moments came not on a grand public stage, but in a private meeting room, somewhere behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, when a team of royal physicians quietly laid out the full picture of his father, King Charles III's health. What they told him that day was not breaking news in the traditional sense. There were no cameras, no press releases, no carefully worded statements from the palace communications team. Just a son sitting across from doctors, hearing words that no child ever wants to hear about their parent. And by all accounts, William did not take it well. Those who were present, or who later learned what happened, described him as visibly shaken. One source close to the family said the prince left the room a different man than the one who walked in. That is where this story truly begins. Not in February 2024, when Buckingham Palace first announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer following a procedure to treat an enlarged prostate. Not in the careful, measured language, the palace used to reassure the public that the king would step back from duties temporarily, but remain involved in state business behind the scenes. Not even in the months that followed, when Charles made gradual appearances at public events, always with a warm smile and enough energy to greet well-wishers and make small jokes. This story begins before any of that became public knowledge, in the years and the quiet private moments that shaped the relationship between a father and a son who were never quite able to say what they truly felt to each other, but who loved each other in the particular, complicated way that royals do. King Charles III came to the throne in September 2022 after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. He had waited longer than any heir in British history, spending decades in a role that gave him purpose, but never quite the authority he craved. He was 73 years old when he was finally crowned, and the British public, who had sometimes been skeptical of him over the years, watched his coronation with a mixture of ceremony and something softer, a kind of quiet respect for a man who had outlasted the critics and the scandals and the tragedies, and had arrived at this moment with real gravity. His speeches were thoughtful. His commitments to the environment and to social causes were genuine. He seemed, to many observers, like a king who understood the weight of what he was carrying. William watched all of that very closely. He was 40 years old when his grandmother died and his father became king. He had spent his entire adult life being trained and prepared for the monarchy, attending briefings, accompanying his grandmother on engagements, sitting in meetings about constitutional matters, learning the machinery of the institution from the inside. He understood what it meant to be next in line, and he understood better than most people what his father was stepping into. But there is a difference between understanding something intellectually and feeling it emotionally. And for William, the moment his father was crowned was also the moment he moved from being the son of the Prince of Wales to being the Prince of Wales himself, the heir apparent, one step closer to the role that would one day define his life. Father and son have always had a relationship that is difficult to characterize simply. In public, they present a united front. They appear together at official engagements, exchange handshakes that sometimes soften into something warmer, and say the right things at the right moments. But behind closed doors, people who know the family well describe a dynamic that is more layered. Charles has always been a man of deep passions and strong opinions, someone who throws himself entirely into whatever project or cause has captured his attention. William is similar in temperament, intense, driven, protective, but he expresses it differently. He is more guarded, more strategic, quicker to control what the outside world sees. There have been arguments between them over the years, genuine ones, the kind that come from two strong personalities who care deeply about the same things, but do not always agree on how to pursue them. And yet when the cancer diagnosis came, none of that history mattered in the way it might have in an ordinary family. What mattered was that William's father was ill, seriously ill, and the picture that the doctors had given William behind those closed palace doors was more concerning than anything that had been communicated to the public. What the public knew in early 2024 was that the king had gone to hospital in January for a planned procedure to treat a benign enlarged prostate, a common condition in men his age, and not in itself alarming. What the public did not immediately know was that during the course of that procedure, doctors had discovered something else. A form of cancer had been detected, separate from the prostate condition. The palace confirmed this in February 2024, and the announcement was handled with the characteristic precision of the royal communications machine. There was enough information to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation without causing outright panic. The king, they said, would begin a schedule of regular treatments. He would step back temporarily from public-facing duties. He was in good spirits and was grateful for the messages of support flooding in from around the world. The British public received this news with a kind of restrained collective anxiety. They had already been through another health scare involving the royal family, with Princess Catherine, William's wife, having revealed her own cancer diagnosis in March 2024, just weeks after Charles's announcement. Two members of the royal family, both dealing with cancer simultaneously, both going through treatment, both stepping back from public duties. For an institution that projects stability and continuity above everything else, this was an extraordinary moment of vulnerability. But for William, who was watching both his father and his wife navigate serious illness at the same time, it was something else entirely. Those close to him described a man who was holding himself together with enormous effort. He was still carrying out public engagements. He was still showing up, still smiling in the right moments, still saying the right words in his public statements. But the strain was visible to those who knew him well. His eyes carried something different. There was a tightness around him that had not been there before. One aide who worked with him during this period later said that William had always been someone who felt things deeply but rarely showed it, and that watching him manage those months was one of the most striking things they had ever witnessed in a professional context. The months that followed the initial diagnosis were defined by a careful management of information. The palace gave updates when they had something specific to say, but they were deliberate about not revealing the type of cancer the king had been diagnosed with, citing the king's wishes for medical privacy. Speculation filled the gaps, as it always does. Some commentators noted that Charles had lost weight. Others pointed to moments in his public appearances where he seemed more fatigued than usual, where the careful royal posture seemed to cost him more effort than it once had. Supporters pointed in the opposite direction, highlighting the moments when Charles appeared energetic and engaged, meeting well-wishers, visiting hospitals and community projects, maintaining the rhythm of royal life with what seemed like genuine determination. By mid-2024, Catherine had completed 6 months of preventive chemotherapy and was beginning the slow, careful process of returning to public life. Her return was handled with extraordinary sensitivity. She had made a video announcement in March explaining her diagnosis and asking for privacy, and the palace had respected that in the months that followed. When she began to re-emerge, the public response was warm and enormous. The relief was palpable. People had missed her, had worried about her, and her return felt like something good in what had been a very difficult year for the royal family. Charles continued his treatment. He made more public appearances as 2024 moved into 2025. He attended events, traveled where his health permitted, and showed up with enough visible energy to reassure both his subjects and the institution he led. But behind the scenes, those who were close to the situation knew that the picture was more complicated. His illness was being managed rather than cured. The treatments were ongoing. The palace was not hiding this exactly, but they were framing it carefully, as they always do, in the language of optimism and continuity. It was in this context that William found himself, in late 2024 and into early 2025, carrying a weight that had grown steadily heavier. His father was continuing treatment. His wife was recovering. He was absorbing more and more of the public-facing royal responsibilities, standing in at events where Charles would once have been present, taking on diplomatic and ceremonial functions that reflected his growing role in the institution. Some observers noted that William had begun to show a new seriousness in his public appearances, a kind of gravity that went beyond the natural maturity of a man in his early 40s. He seemed, in some indefinable way, to be preparing for something. Whether that preparation was conscious or not, only William knows. What is known is that the medical updates he received about his father during this period were not encouraging in the ways that the public statements suggested. The king's treatment was complex. His recovery was not a straight line. There were setbacks, including a brief hospitalization in March 2025 due to side effects from his cancer treatment, which the palace described as a minor setback. From the outside, that framing may have seemed sufficient. But for William, every setback was a reminder of the reality that the doctors had laid out for him. that his father was fighting something serious, that the outcome was not guaranteed, and that the day he had spent his entire life preparing for might be coming sooner than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The relationship between William and Charles had deepened in ways that neither of them might have fully anticipated. In ordinary times, the relationship between a king and his heir carries a certain professional distance built into it, not coldness exactly, but a formality that comes from shared understanding of their roles. But illness strips formality away. When a parent is unwell and a child is watching, the professional distances collapse, and what is left underneath is just the raw human fact of love and fear and helplessness. William, for all his training and all his preparation, could not train his way out of that. He could not prepare a strategy for the feeling of sitting in a room and being told that his father's health was more serious than the palace had publicly acknowledged. People who have spent time around William during this period describe a man who had clearly done a great deal of internal work to process what he was going through. He was not falling apart publicly. He was not retreating from his duties. In fact, he was doing the opposite, throwing himself more fully into his work, taking on more, showing up earlier and staying later, as though motion itself was a way of managing what could not be resolved. This is a pattern that people who know him well recognized as quintessentially William. He has always responded to difficulty with action rather than expression, with presence rather than words. But there were cracks, small ones, visible to those paying close attention. In a television interview in late 2024, he was asked about his father's health, and for just a moment before the professional composure settled back into place, something moved across his face. It was brief, the kind of thing that most people watching would not catch at all, but those who knew what he was carrying understood what it meant. He was not just a prince being asked a diplomatic question. He was a son who was frightened for his father and doing everything in his power not to show it. And that image of a man who loves his father and is frightened and is holding it together with every tool he has is the one that cuts through all the royal protocol and all the palace communications and all the carefully managed public narratives, and lands somewhere simple and human and true. Because at the end of every title, at the end of every official role and public responsibility and hereditary duty, William and Charles are a father and a son. And what was happening to them, in the private moments behind the palace walls, was not the story of a monarchy in transition. It was the story of a family facing something painful together, the way families do, with love and fear and the particular kind of courage that only comes when you have no choice but to keep going. That is the story this is, and it was far from over. By the time 2025 arrived, the world outside the palace gates had settled into a kind of uneasy rhythm with the news of King Charles's health. People had grown accustomed to the careful updates, the measured reassurances, the steady trickle of public appearances designed to demonstrate that the king was still present, still engaged, still the person at the center of the institution. Buckingham Palace had managed the information around his illness with the expertise that comes from decades of experience handling sensitive royal matters. The public statements were precise. The language was deliberately chosen. Nothing was said that could not be defended, and yet nothing was said that gave the full picture either. William understood this better than anyone. He had grown up watching the palace communications machine operate, had learned early how carefully every word was weighed and every image managed, had seen how the institution protected itself and the people within it through the controlled flow of information. He did not resent it. He understood the necessity of it, but it also meant that the gap between what the public knew and what he knew was not a gap born of deception. It was a gap built on the deep institutional logic of a monarchy that had survived for centuries precisely because it knew when to speak and when to stay silent. What William knew, as 2025 began, was that his father's recovery was more complicated than the public picture suggested. The hospitalization in March 2025, though described by the palace as a minor setback due to treatment side effects, had been more significant than that framing implied. Those close to the situation described a period of real concern inside the palace, a few days when the uncertainty about how the king would respond to treatment felt genuinely frightening. Charles had come through it. He had returned to Windsor Castle to continue his recovery in private. But the episode had left a mark, not only physically but on everyone around him, including William. The spring and summer of 2025 brought a gradual improvement. Charles began to appear at public events with more regularity. He attended the Sandringham Flower Show in July, greeting members of the public warmly, asking about their lives, showing the particular gift he had always had for making people feel seen in brief encounters. When a local man named Lee Harmon told the king about his own experience with cancer and mentioned he had received the all-clear the previous year, Charles told him he was feeling a lot better now and that it was just one of those things. It was a small, human moment, but it reverberated. People held on to it. It became evidence for those who wanted to believe it that the king was genuinely improving, that the worst might be behind them. William saw those appearances and felt something complicated. Relief, yes, but also a kind of careful restraint in allowing himself to feel too much relief, because he understood better than the public did how variable the situation remained. He had learned to hold hope carefully, without gripping it too tightly, because he had received enough private updates to know that the road ahead was uncertain. His father's illness was not following a clean, linear path toward recovery. There were good days and difficult days, and the good days were real, but they did not erase the difficult ones. Through all of this, William was expanding his public role in ways that were visible and significant. He was taking on engagements that would previously have been handled by his father. He was meeting with heads of state, attending diplomatic functions, representing the crown at events where the king's presence would once have been expected. This was not unusual in principle. Princes of Wales have always stood in for monarchs when necessary, but the frequency and the scope of William's expanded role were notable. Observers who tracked the royal schedule could see a pattern forming, one that suggested the institution was quietly redistributing the weight of its public duties in a way that reflected the reality of the king's health. Royal commentators began to discuss this shift openly. Some noted that William and Catherine together at public events projected a particular kind of energy, youthful, confident, forward-looking, that contrasted with the frailty that Charles sometimes showed. At a state banquet in March 2026, observers described the contrast between William and Kate arriving looking every inch the future monarch and queen consort, while Charles appeared at moments to be visibly exhausted. One insider described a moment where the king seemed to almost slump in his chair during the evening, as though the effort of maintaining the formal demands of the occasion had become genuinely difficult. Buckingham Palace did not comment on those accounts. They continued to emphasize stability and the king's ongoing commitment to his duties, and that commitment was genuine. Charles had not retreated. He had not abdicated. He continued to conduct state business, to sign documents, to receive ministers, to fulfill the constitutional functions that were his to fulfill. But the gap between what he was doing and what a king in full health would have been doing was becoming harder to ignore. For William, this period was defined by a particular kind of emotional discipline. He was moving through a world that kept asking him in 1,000 different ways whether he was ready to take on more, ready to step into a larger role, ready, ultimately, for the thing that all of this was building toward. And he had to navigate those questions while also being a son watching his father struggle, while also being a husband to a wife who had her own recovery to manage, while also being a father to 3 children who were watching their family face things that children should not have to face. People who have studied William closely over the years say that the period from 2024 through 2025 and into 2026 changed him in ways that are visible if you know what you are looking for. He became harder to read, more contained, more careful about what he allowed to show on his face or in his words. Some took this as a sign of coldness, of the kind of emotional distance that critics had sometimes attributed to him. But those who knew him better described it differently. It was not distance. It was weight. He was carrying something enormous, and he had found a way to carry it that did not break him, but it had cost him something in the process. The lightness that had occasionally been visible in earlier years, the flashes of humor, the moments of visible joy, were less frequent. What replaced them was a steadiness that was real and earned, and not without its own kind of dignity. In December 2025, Charles himself made the most significant public statement about his health since the original diagnosis. In a pre-recorded message for Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer broadcast, he spoke directly to the nation about where things stood. He told viewers that thanks to early diagnosis, effective intervention, and following doctors' orders, his own schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced in the new year. He described this as a personal blessing and spoke about what the advances in cancer care meant not just for him, but for the millions of people around the world facing similar diagnoses. He was measured, warm, and genuinely moving. It was a statement that acknowledged what he had been through without dramatizing it, that offered hope without overpromising, that reflected the particular public grace that Charles had developed over decades in public life. The response was enormous. People across Britain and around the world received the news with real relief. The phrase that his treatment could be reduced was interpreted correctly as a sign that the cancer was responding, that the worst of the intensive treatment phase was moving toward an end, that the path ahead, while still uncertain, was less steep than it had once been. Social media filled with messages of support and relief. Newspapers ran the story with genuine warmth. It felt for a moment like something had turned. William received this news privately before the public statement was made. He had known it was coming. He had been part of the conversations about how to frame it, when to share it, what it meant in the broader context of his father's treatment. And yet, knowing something is coming does not always prepare you for the feeling of it when it actually arrives. Those close to William described him as quietly emotional when the statement was finally broadcast. Not in a way that was visible to the public, not in a way that broke through the composure he maintained so carefully. But in the private moments after, there was something there. Something that looked, to people who knew him well, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and had finally, carefully, allowed himself to exhale. But exhaling is not the same as being relieved, and William understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the reduction in treatment was a positive sign but not a conclusion. Cancer does not work on a schedule. Recovery does not guarantee anything. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the private knowledge that Charles had been fighting this illness for nearly 2 years, that the treatments had been difficult, that there had been setbacks, that the good December news was real but existed alongside a deeper uncertainty that had not disappeared. All of that was still present in William's private understanding of what was happening. What he felt in those quiet moments was something that did not have a clean name. It was not grief because his father was still alive and still fighting. It was not relief because relief implies that the danger has passed and the danger had not passed. It was something in between, something that anyone who has watched a parent fight a serious illness will recognize, a kind of suspended state where you are grateful for every good day while never being quite able to forget that the good days do not erase the larger reality. William, who had lived in that suspended state for nearly 2 years, was still there, still watching, still waiting, still carrying everything he knew and could not say. And the monarchy around him was quietly, carefully beginning to change shape, not through any formal announcement, not through any public declaration of transition, but in the organic, institutional way that monarchies have always adapted, through the redistribution of responsibilities, through the shifting of presence, through the gradual movement of a system that is always, at its core, about continuity, about making sure that whatever happens to any individual within it, the institution itself continues. William was becoming more central to that continuity with every passing month, and everyone who was paying attention could see it. The new year of 2026 arrived carrying both the weight of everything that had happened before it and the fragile hope of what Charles's December statement had suggested might be possible. His cancer treatment would be reduced. He was in a precautionary phase now. The worst, if not behind him entirely, was at least receding. Those were real things. They mattered. And yet for those inside the palace, and for William in particular, the beginning of a new year brought not a clean break from the anxiety of the past 2 years, but a continuation of it, softer in some ways, more manageable but still present, still shaping everything. William began 2026 in a position that would have been almost unrecognizable compared to where he stood before his father's diagnosis. He was now, in practical terms, the public face of the British monarchy in a way that went beyond the normal expectations of a Prince of Wales. The shift had happened gradually, through months of expanded engagements and increased responsibilities, but its cumulative effect was significant. He was the person the world's media looked to when there was royal news. He was the person diplomatic counterparts increasingly expected to see at significant international events. He was, in everything but the formal constitutional title, functioning at a level that bore the full weight of the role his father carried. He handled this with the seriousness it demanded. Those who worked with him during this period described a man who had grown enormously in the role, who had developed a sureness in the way he engaged with complex issues, whether that was environmental policy or international conflict, or the social challenges that had driven his charitable work for years. His public speeches were more confident, more direct, more clearly his own voice rather than a careful approximation of what a future king was supposed to sound like. He had found, through the crucible of the past 2 years, something that looked like authority. Not the inherited kind, not the kind that comes simply from being next in line, but the earned kind that comes from being tested and not breaking. Catherine was by his side through all of it. Her own recovery from cancer had continued through 2025 and into 2026, and she had returned to public life with a presence that was quietly extraordinary. Those who had known her before her diagnosis described a woman who had changed through her experience in ways she herself had spoken about openly. She had said in her own public statement that her illness had caused her to think differently about what mattered and what did not. That reflection was visible in the way she moved through her public role now. She was warmer, more direct, less concerned with getting every performative detail exactly right and more focused on the human connections that the work allowed. She and William together made a formidable partnership, and the public could feel it. But the private life they shared was still shaped by what they had both been through. Two parents, both in their early 40s, who had watched cancer move through their family from two different directions. One fighting it themselves, and one watching a parent fight it, and both of them doing all of that while also raising 3 children and fulfilling the public demands of their roles. The sheer human weight of those 2 years was something that no external narrative could fully capture, because it happened in the moments between the public appearances, in the evenings after the children were in bed, in the quiet conversations that do not make it into any official record. For William, the spring of 2026 brought a particular kind of tension. On one hand, the signs from his father were genuinely encouraging. Charles had begun the year with reduced treatment, was appearing at public engagements with more regularity, and was showing the kind of quiet resilience that had characterized his entire approach to his illness. He did not dramatize it. He did not invite sympathy. He simply kept going, kept showing up, kept doing the work of being king with the particular dignity that the role demanded and that Charles, perhaps more than people had always given him credit for, was genuinely capable of. On the other hand, the structural reality that the monarchy was going through, a transition, was becoming harder to ignore. The conversations that royal insiders and commentators were having openly in 2026 about succession timelines and the gradual redistribution of royal authority reflected a broader recognition that something had shifted. Royal warrants, the formal endorsements that carry the royal seal and had historically been granted exclusively by the reigning monarch, were increasingly being associated with William in ways that reflected his growing centrality to the institution. There was no formal announcement, there was no constitutional change, but the movement was real and the people within the institution felt it. William himself navigated this with the same careful discipline he brought to everything. He did not speak publicly about succession. He did not position himself in ways that could be read as impatient or ambitious. He consistently and genuinely directed attention back to his father when the question of transition came up, making clear that Charles was the king and that his role was to support the king. This was not merely diplomatic. Those who knew him said it came from a real place. William loved his father. He did not want the throne at his father's expense. He wanted his father to be well. He wanted more time. He wanted the thing that all of us want when someone we love is ill, which is for the illness to simply go away and for the person to still be there. But he also understood, with the particular clarity that comes from knowing too much, that wanting something does not make it so. The cancer was real. The uncertainty was real, and William had accepted, in the quiet private reckoning that no one else could do for him, that his life was moving towards something he had no power to stop or slow. What he could control was who he was when he got there, what kind of king he would be, what he would bring to the role that no amount of preparation could give him, but that the experience of the past 2 years had, in some terrible and irreplaceable way, begun to forge. The most revealing insight into what William was carrying came, not from any official statement, but from the small moments that sometimes slipped through the carefully managed public surface. A moment in a televised appearance where he was asked about his father, and something crossed his face, some movement beneath the composure, before he answered steadily and moved on. A comment he made at a charitable event where he described having learned in recent years the importance of holding things lightly, of understanding that control is an illusion, and that real strength is found in how you respond to what you cannot control. It was the kind of comment that could have meant many things, but those who knew what he had been living through heard it clearly. There was also the matter of Harry. Throughout the years of Charles's illness, the estrangement between William and his brother had remained one of the most painful and unresolved elements of the family's situation. Harry had left the royal family, had made his life in California with Meghan and their children, had written and spoken about his family in ways that had caused real pain to those who remained. The relationship between the brothers, which had once been the great emotional foundation of both their lives, the thing they had clung to after their mother's death, had been broken in ways that neither side had managed to repair. Charles, who loved both his sons and who had tried in his private way to keep some thread of connection alive, had been reported to have maintained some contact with Harry throughout his illness. The idea of a father using whatever time and energy he had to try to hold his fractured family together, even while fighting cancer, was one of the most quietly heartbreaking aspects of the entire story. And for William, who had his own deep feelings about what Harry had done and said, watching his father spend precious energy trying to bridge a gap that Harry had created was something he found profoundly difficult. He did not say this publicly. He did not need to. The complex, fraught, unresolved nature of the William and Harry relationship was one of the most discussed dynamics in royal coverage, and the broad outlines of where things stood were well understood. What was less well understood was how much it was costing William, in the specific context of his father's illness, to hold his own position while watching his father pursue a reconciliation that William did not fully support. This was not about cruelty or coldness. It was about the particular pain of a person who felt that his family had been hurt and who could not simply set that aside because his father wanted peace. Human relationships, even royal ones, do not operate on the logic of simple forgiveness or simple reconciliation. They operate on the messier logic of real injury and real history and the complicated work of deciding what to do with both. William was in the middle of that messiness, and he had to navigate it while also managing everything else he was carrying. As the months of 2026 moved forward, the picture that emerged was of a family and a monarchy that had been genuinely tested and had not broken. King Charles was still on the throne. He was still carrying out his duties. His treatment was in a reduced phase that suggested the cancer was being managed, if not defeated. He had shown a resilience that surprised even some of his critics, a refusal to be diminished by the illness that spoke to something deep in his character. Whether that resilience was the product of decades of training, or of genuine personal strength, or simply of the particular stubbornness that sometimes comes with age and the accumulation of hard-won self-knowledge, it was real and it was remarkable. William was still Prince of Wales, still the heir, still carrying the knowledge and the weight that came with both. But he was something else now, too. He was a man who had been through something that had changed him, who had faced the prospect of losing his father while also watching his wife fight her own battle and had kept going, kept showing up, kept doing the work, who had found, in the process of carrying that weight, a depth and a steadiness that had not been as visible before, who had, in some sense, become more fully himself through the experience of being tested in the most personal way imaginable. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years through changes that should have broken it, wars and scandals and constitutional crises, and the deaths of beloved monarchs and the failures of others. It has survived because the institution is larger than any individual within it, and because the individuals within it have, mostly, understood that their role is to serve something beyond themselves. Charles understood that. He had understood it his whole life, had waited patiently for it, had then found himself fighting for his health while trying to fulfill it. William understood it too, had spent his entire life preparing for it, and was now, in the most human and unscheduled way possible, being prepared for it in the way that no briefing document or constitutional education could replicate. What came next was not yet written. The future of the British monarchy, like all futures, remained uncertain. What was known was that a father and a son had faced something enormous together and had not been destroyed by it. That the love between them, complicated and imperfect, and sometimes expressed in the particular silence of people who do not quite know how to say what they feel, had held. And that in the quiet space between what was known publicly and what was felt privately, there was a story that was deeply human and worth understanding, not because it was royal, but because it was true.